I'm here with Keri Rodrigues of the National Parents Union. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I wondered, just to start, if could you introduce us to the National Parents Union, for those unfamiliar?
Absolutely. So again, my name is Keri Rodrigues. I'm Matthew, Miles, and David's mom. Very honored to lead the National Parents Union, which is a collective of more than 1,600 affiliated parent organizations in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. And these are all extraordinary pockets of parent power across the nation where parents are coming together to have a voice around politics and policy.
Wonderful. So, with that work of parents advocacy, what do you think are the enabling conditions that you've identified that need to shift in order for parents to be empowered to advocate for their child's literacy and education as a whole?
Honestly, I think a lot of those conditions are shifting and have shifted. One of the bright spots of the pandemic was a great awakening of parents because education was really unfolding in our living rooms for the good and for the bad. So we got a firsthand look at really what our children were experiencing. And we saw some things that we liked and we saw some things that we didn't like. So what I've seen unfolding in the past couple of years is really this great awakening of parents who I think were just kind of on autopilot for a long time and assuming that, you just drop your kid off at the school door and let them handle it. And now parents are much more awake and they're seeking new options and new alternatives and new ways of being a part of the education conversation, which has been met with some welcoming, but also a lot of opposition because the system is very comfortable operating the way it has. Nothing to see here, parents, we've got it handled. So it's not always, the most welcoming environment. What we find is really important is making sure that these pockets of parent power and these parents that are coming together across the country, that they have the skills and the opportunities to learn and really develop their organizations and their pockets so that they can be effective. Because parents are critical stakeholders in education, but it's just been very unfortunate that we're not treated with the dignity and respect that we should have as the folks that really have a vested interest in the success of the system.
And those that most likely know their child the best.
Well, you would think, right? But so often in education advocacy, while those words are said, it's often met with great skepticism. Do we know what we're talking about? How do you know that? And quite often parents and families are treated as if we're not full adults and not capable of participating in conversations or knowing and being able to participate in some development of solutions in terms of what we actually want to see. What people also forget as well is that the parents of today many of us were the underserved kids of previous generations. So we actually have firsthand lived experiences of what we saw and what we liked and didn't like in school and how we were served or not served in schools. And we have a vested interest in making sure that the system evolves so that it actually meets the needs of today's kids.
Yeah, I like how you put it, that the system can evolve, and that's the theme of a lot of the conversations I've been having. And I wonder, how does NPU's work center students with learning differences?
Well, so many of the best advocates in education justice are parents of children who have learning differences. That's how I came in to this movement. I was the mom of a little boy who is just absolutely extraordinary. His name is Matthew, and he is so bright and creative and academically talented and just lights up the world with a unique and different perspective. He also happens to have ADHD and autism. And I knew as a mom very early on, from about 18 months old, that he was going to need additional support and help, and did everything I possibly could to advocate for him. But still, when he was in kindergarten, he was suspended 36 times. And over again, I was sitting at the end of an IEP table, surrounded by people who were supposedly experts on, helping kids, navigate classrooms and build coping skills. And, I have a GED from Boston Public Schools, and these guys all had master's degrees. But, as Matthew's mom sitting there, I could also tell that even with these master's degrees, they were pretty angry with my kid. And pissed off and frustrated, and had given up on him in kindergarten, and were just putting him in a redirect room over and over again. And I realized at the end of that IEP table that I didn't have a voice, that I wasn't being heard or listened to. But I also knew I wasn't unique. And I'm an organizer. I've been a community organizer for almost 30 years now. And that's what I do. I always say, when I was young, I used to organize girls to go fight. And now I organize girls to go fight. Just a different opportunity, and the fight has changed a little bit. But, I'm not unique. Parents across this country, especially those of children who are extraordinary and see the world a little bit differently and may have some additional needs and require additional supports, you learn very early on that, unfortunately, you have to become an advocate. You have to become an activist, because without that, your child is very susceptible to being, failed, to be falling through the cracks. They're not going to tell you everything that is possible, everything your kid needs. You've got to become an expert pretty instantaneously. So in the National Parents Union, and frankly in parent advocacy, across the country, what you're going to find is that many of these movements, many of these pockets of parent power are started by, mamas that had to learn that lesson firsthand. And what we seek to do is make sure that, that experience of me being a mom, sitting at an IEP table by myself and realizing I had no voice, I never want to be at that table alone again. And I never want any other parent to be at that table alone again. And that is what we've built in with MPU.
Yeah. So what is MPU doing with these? I like that term, parents of or pockets of parent power. So, on the practical level, on the ground, what's MPU doing with parents in those pockets to build that advocacy and to build their power?
So we have, throughout our network, these pockets that are in varying levels of development. Sometimes it's, 4 parents in a living room who are really aggravated because their favorite school board member is being pushed out. And they're deeply concerned that they're not going to get adequate representation on the board for, Latino children, because this person's going to lose, their position.
Sure.
But they're not a group. They're just 4 parents in a living room. And we'll get a 911 call saying, like, there's a problem here. We can see there's a problem. There's a group of us. What do we do? And MPU will come in and literally, teach them how to form an organization, teach them how to run an action. How do you get a sound system? How do you get a permit?
Sure.
How do you put out a press release? How do you raise some pizza money so you can pay people to actually stay at a school board meeting for 8 hours at a time? So some of those basic things. And then, teaching folks the system, like, if you have a complaint and a problem, who do you actually agitate to make change? How do you get one of those policy positions so you can change, some of the regulations, the policies that are hurting kids or just aren't wrong for a particular community? So there's a lot of that, like, individual building and in support of our affiliates to make sure that they're strong, because it's not for us to parachute into somebody's community and say, like, well, we can see what the problem is. Parents know. Like, we are deeply connected and can identify those. We're here to support and help them find voice. On the state level, we bring together these pockets of parent power to find solidarity. So in many of our states, we will build something called a parent power agenda, which are 3 to 5 things that we all believe should be changed or we should work on together. And we build a coalition so that we can pass a law or elect a governor or whatever needs to happen so that, we can make sure the voices of parents and families and the people who are closest to the pain are actually heard at that level. And on the federal level, we bring together hundreds of thousands of parents to actually make sure that the voices of parents and families, we reach up to 20 million families across the country.
Wow.
Are actually heard by, some of the most powerful people in the nation who are responsible for crafting a lot of the policies that directly impact families, whether it's from the child tax credit to meeting with Secretary Cardona around education issues, to meeting with the Secretary of Health and Human Services around health issues for our children and making sure they have clean indoor air quality. All of these things that directly impact parents and families. And it doesn't even stop there. We've even taken parents to the United Nations to testify about the literacy crisis and the fact that that is something that we must address to change the trajectory of the future for our children so that every child has access to economic mobility.
Sure. Yeah. And in regards to that literacy crisis, I wonder if parents are listening to this and they're interested in these pockets of power that you're describing, the advocacy that you're describing, just kind of this increased role that maybe they didn't know was available to them. I wonder, how can parents learn more about their rights to advocate for their children in terms of these literary and intervention supports?
So the number one piece of advice that I want to give to parents and really anybody is to trust your gut. If you're sitting with your child and there is any question in your mind that your child is struggling to read or is not reading at grade level, that you've got to intervene. You've got to speak up and you've got to advocate. You cannot just rely on report cards that say A or B on them, which are very subjective and frankly don't give you the information you need to take the action steps necessary to help your kids. Like, ask the questions. If there's something wrong in your gut and you know that your child is struggling, don't wait. Ask educators, intervene, get outside support.
Sure.
You can reach out to the National Parents Union. We're happy to connect you. If you know across your school, across your district, across your state, that kids are struggling to read, parents have been some of the most effective voices in really changing the tide. In Minnesota, we had parents that not only elected themselves to the Minneapolis School Board, but were able to get rid of a bad superintendent, change the literacy curriculum, move it over to another major city and change the curriculum there, going through the same process. Then they wrote a state law called the READ Act, which guarantees 1.3 million children across Minnesota the right to read proficiently by third grade. And it's not just a suggestion, it's now an actionable right. So if your child is not reading proficiently by third grade and there is no intervention triggered, you now can take those districts to court and hold them accountable for inaction. And that comes from parents. And that kind of law is now catching on like wildfire. And you're seeing changes in places like New York and Massachusetts, where just this year, in January of 2024, you had governors who are now saying that literacy and the crisis in their states are going to be one of their top priorities in their State of the State address. That didn't happen by accident. That happened because members of the National Parents Union were like a pit bull with a stake, saying, Kathy Hochul, you got to get on this. Governor Healy, you got to get on this. Whether it's in Massachusetts, whether it's in New York, whether it's in Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, across this country, there are parents everywhere who are standing up saying, we can see that there's a problem. We need you to focus and we want you to take action. And they're making it happen.
I love what you're describing, where parents have a role not just with their kids, not just with their kids' teachers, but with their kids' schools, with their kids' school systems, with their districts, with up to the state, and perhaps even much beyond that. What are you working on now with NPU that just different projects that you're excited about right now?
We are very excited that we are going to take several hundred parents to Washington, D.C. in the next few months to literally be advocating for literacy. And we're working on a joint resolution in the Senate right now with Democrats and Republicans coming together to support a resolution that would that says that we should be guaranteeing every child in America the right to read by third grade. We run national polls. We've done 38 national polls. So we can quantify that 81% of American families believe that that should be an actionable right for parents.
Wow, yeah.
And so it's something that's bipartisan. It's a no-brainer, and it can actually show that government can function and do something. Now, we're also going to bring parents directly to the White House, where President Biden has invited them in to have a conversation with him about the priorities of parents, specifically around literacy and addressing the literacy crisis we have in this country, and getting, the backing of the most powerful man in the world, as we would say, to really get some support behind this. So we're very encouraged by that. But resolutions won't get it done. And so one of the most important things that we're doing right now is taking a look at ESSA and planning for 2026 ESSA reauthorization to make sure that there is much more robust language around literacy reform, math reform, protecting assessment and accountability, so that we have a measuring stick by which we can measure progress and redirect resources. There's a lot of work to be done, and that's just at the federal level, making sure that we're in constant contact with our state chiefs to make sure that they're in proximity to parents and families, because sometimes these guys, they get these fancy jobs and they think they don't have to talk to us anymore. But I would argue that we're some of the most important people to talk to. But also having really innovative conversations around reimagining schools so that it's more focused on outcomes. 94% of American families believe every child should leave K through 12 education with a pathway to either college or career, but really a direct plan for what the next steps look like. And so what we need to be doing is listening to parents, to families, to students about what they want K through 12 education to be reimagined to look like, instead of just holding on to a 190-year-old antiquated model of education where it's one white woman at the head of a classroom in front of 25 to 30 kids droning on and on as we all sit in desks. So much has evolved, and we need to do everything we possibly can to put pressure on the system to start evolving in meaningful ways, instead of just these little baby steps we take. There's so much that we've learned about not just the science of reading, but the science of how kids learn and when they learn and how they learn. Unfortunately, our system is just not keeping pace with what we need to see. And so that is going to be something that's a top priority for us.
Yeah, I love the way you put it, that we're reimagining the future. And, from what you've said, and NPU's had plenty of strong successes at, like you were saying, local, state, national level. But along the lines of that reimagining, in your mind, what is the long-term benefit of the long-term, I guess you could say, goal, benefit? What does it look like for in the future for NPU if NPU continues to be as radically successful as it's been?
Well, we don't want to be an afterthought. We don't want the voices of parents and families to continue to just be a box checking exercise. And frankly, we don't want to see parents and families brought in after the cake is baked to decide what kind of frosting we want and what kind of sprinkles. We want to be asked if we're hungry. Do we want a cake? Do you want a hamburger?
Sure.
And that part of the process is when parents and families need to be brought in as critical stakeholders about what we're doing in education. So often we don't bring in the perspective of the people who actually have to deal with the consequences of our failures or what these outcomes look like. Because to be honest with you, if we continue to underserve kids across this country and don't adequately prepare them for the future, a lot of that consequence rests on the shoulders, obviously, of our children. Like for kids like mine, those consequences are things like poverty, incarceration, death even. And those are real tangible consequences. But even if you are successful and you graduate from K through 12 education, too many of our kids have to take 2 years of remedial courses before they can even take a college level course. Our kids are not even prepared for the jobs of today, let alone jobs we haven't even imagined yet. And if we're ever going to get kids to economic mobility, and that's really what's different about us and why we need to be part of the conversation, is that that is the end goal for us.
Right.
It's not a piece of paper that we get handed at the end of a stage, at the end of 12 years of participating in a system. What we're trying to get kids to economic mobility, and we need the system to evolve to realize that that's what we're trying to prepare kids for. And so our lens is different. It's much more urgent. And our end goal is to try to get everybody in this conversation to understand that parents aren't a nice to have. We're not a box you have to check to say you've engaged us, but you need our context. You need our lens, you need our participation, and you need our urgency if we're all going to actually get to the outcomes that we're looking for.
That's wonderful. So part of the Educating All Learners Alliance's primary work is in helping create what we call a pathway to possible for educators, caregivers, parents across the country. Could you give an actionable step for folks in this space to take away from this conversation in order to create that equitable path forward for children with learning disabilities?
What I find so upsetting to me as a mom who has an exceptional child,
Sure,
is the fact that we have really reduced their experience to just getting through it, and we don't see them capable of proficiency, let alone excellence. I have a child who's brilliant, who needs to be in a therapeutic classroom in a therapeutic setting. And he goes to a therapeutic high school, and he's a 10th grader. And he's brilliant and should have access to the same academic rigor and challenging content and exciting pathways that any other generally matriculating child should have. And he doesn't. And I often think about, what the world is losing, not having Matthew's gifts and talents available to it, because he's just not afforded the same opportunities, because I don't know, he gets overstimulated when he's in a classroom environment that has 25, 30 kids. His lens and his view of the world, to me, is not a deficit. It's a difference. And so when I get the opportunity to go and tour innovation schools where we're talking about things like cybersecurity and coding and all of these incredible things, I always think about Matthew, like that is a place where Matthew should be. And sometimes when I have the opportunity to have conversations with administrators and people running those schools, and I say, well, so tell me about your program for kids with special needs. Like, how many special ed kids are able to come and access these programs? They're an afterthought. And, maybe there's a couple, but this isn't really for them. Absolutely it is. And what are we losing? When we don't give kids the access to those opportunities? It's heartbreaking, because, some of our most brilliant coders, some of our next AI engineers, our cybersecurity experts. I mean, the things that we look at in terms of kids having deficits, these are actually major assets because they view the world differently. And I just would love for all of us to have that mindset shift and stop with the deficit mindset of these kids and really understand that just because something's different doesn't mean it's less. Sometimes it can be so much more. And I know as a mom what Matthew brings to my life and how it has changed my perspective and how I look at things and how much I value him and his counsel. Sometimes I check in with him to be like, what do you think about this? Like, how do you see this? Because his lens is valuable to me, and I don't see everything. Just because I'm a neurotypical person, doesn't mean that my lens is always correct. So I would love to see us evolve in that conversation and change the way we look at these kids, because it's not a deficiency. Like, some of these kids could be, the next scientists of the future, the philosophers, and can open us up to different things. And how much do we lose when we just categorize them as not being worth it?
That's wonderful. Keri, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.